He was a man of God, a priest who stood at the pulpit every Sunday, speaking of love, compassion, and forgiveness. To his congregation he was a symbol of faith, a guide for the troubled, a man they could trust. But behind closed doors, behind the walls of his home, there was a much darker side, a side no one could have imagined. It was a quiet evening in the spring of 2019, when 17-year-old Jacob made a brave decision. For years he had carried a secret, one that weighed heavily on his heart. He loved someone, deeply, but it wasn't the kind of love his father, the priest, would ever accept. That night, Jacob sat down with trembling hands, looked his father in the eyes, and told him the truth. He was gay, and he was in love. What happened next would shock an entire community and leave a scar on everyone who heard about it. A father, a priest, a man who claimed to live by the principles of mercy and understanding, turned his own son's confession into a crime scene. The screams from that house echoed through the neighborhood, but no one could have imagined the horror taking place inside. When the police finally arrived, it was too late. Jacob lay lifeless on the floor, his body battered, his spirit crushed. And the man who did it? The father who was supposed to protect him? He showed no remorse. Instead, he justified his actions in the name of religion, claiming that Jacob's love was a sin and that his punishment was deserved. This is not just a story about one family's tragedy. It's a story about the devastating consequences of hatred, intolerance, and the lengths to which some will go when blinded by prejudice. How could a man of faith commit such an unthinkable act? What led to this moment of violence? And how did the community respond when their trusted priest was revealed as a murderer? Tonight, we take you inside the chilling case of the Catholic priest who beat his teenage son to death after learning he was gay. This is a story of love, betrayal, and a truth that cost a young boy his life. Stay with us as we unravel the events that led to this horrific crime and the shocking aftermath that left an entire town reeling. To understand the tragedy that unfolded in this small town, we must first meet the key players in this heartbreaking story. At the center of it all was Father Michael, a well-respected Catholic priest in a tight-knit community in Alabama. Known for his fiery sermons that often emphasized the importance of family values, morality, and faith, he stood as a pillar of righteousness in the eyes of his congregation. People looked up to him. They trusted him. To them, Father Michael was a man of principle, a guide who led them on the path of salvation. But behind the facade of this devoted priest, behind the walls of his home, the reality was far different. Within the confines of his household, the warmth of faith was replaced by an icy intolerance. Father Michael's convictions were rigid, and his understanding of love was conditional, bound by the strict doctrines of the church that he served. The expectations he placed upon his family were suffocating, and those who dared to stray from the path he prescribed faced the harshest consequences. Then there was Jacob, Father Michael's only son. At just 17 years old, Jacob was a quiet, artistic boy with a heart full of dreams and a spirit yearning to be free. He loved to draw, to paint, and to express himself in ways that often felt at odds with the rigid expectations of his father. Deep down, Jacob struggled with his identity, caught in a turmoil of emotions as he tried to reconcile who he was with the strict religious values that surrounded him. For years, Jacob kept his truth a secret, hiding his feelings behind a mask of conformity. He was terrified of his father's reaction, knowing that the world he lived in was not kind to those who dared to be different. The fear of rejection loomed large in his mind, and he often wondered if he would ever find the courage to reveal his true self. But on that fateful night, Jacob decided it was time. He gathered his thoughts and braced himself for what he hoped would be a moment of acceptance. He hoped that perhaps, just perhaps, his father would show him the love he so desperately needed. Little did he know, the very act of revealing his identity would lead to unimaginable consequences. In many conservative religious communities, the stigma against LGBTQ+ individuals runs deep. For those who identify as gay, the struggle for acceptance is often met with hostility, rejection, and even violence. Studies have shown that LGBTQ+ youth are significantly more likely to experience abuse and neglect in families where traditional religious beliefs dominate. In fact, research indicates that nearly 40% of homeless youth identify as LGBTQ+, many of whom have been rejected by their families due to their sexual orientation. As we delve deeper into this story, we must remember the immense pressure that Jacob faced in a world that often demonizes those who are different. His journey was not just about seeking acceptance from his father, it was a fight for his very existence in a society that had taught him to hide who he truly was. This is the context that surrounds this tragic tale, one where love should have prevailed, but instead it was overshadowed by fear and prejudice. Jacob's relationship with his father, Father Michael, was fraught with tension. To the outside world they seemed like a typical father and son, but beneath the surface lay a chasm of misunderstanding and fear. Father Michael demanded obedience and piety, instilling in Jacob the strict rules of their faith. But while he preached about love and acceptance from the pulpit, at home, those words felt hollow. Jacob often felt like a stranger in his own house, isolated and misunderstood, with no one to turn to for support. The loss of Jacob's mother years prior had left a profound void. She had been his protector, his confidant, the one person who understood him. Without her, the walls of their home felt even more suffocating. Every day Jacob wrestled with his identity in silence, grappling with the fear that revealing his true self might lead to rejection, or worse. A fear that was all too real in the conservative environment he lived in. As the days turned into weeks and months, Jacob felt an overwhelming weight on his shoulders. The secret he carried was not just about his sexuality. It was about the essence of who he was. But on the evening of March 15, 2019, Jacob finally mustered the courage to confront his father. He could no longer live a lie. It was a moment of vulnerability, a chance to seek acceptance in the one place he should have felt safe. With his heart racing and his palms sweaty, Jacob approached Father Michael, trembling with fear and anticipation. "Ah," he said softly, his voice barely above a whisper, "I need to tell you something important." As he looked into his father's eyes, he hoped to see compassion reflected back at him. "I'm gay, and I'm in a relationship with someone I love. His name is Alex, and he's a student at my school." But instead of the understanding Jacob desperately sought, what happened next would forever alter the course of their lives. Father Michael's expression darkened, his eyes filled with fury. Instead of offering a comforting word, he exploded into a rage that Jacob could never have prepared for. Witnesses who later recounted the scene described Father Michael's reaction as demonic, as if the man who had once preached love had been consumed by something far more sinister. In that moment, Father Michael accused Jacob of bringing shame to their family and the church. His words cut deep, echoing through the walls of their home like a death knell. "You have betrayed our family. You've turned your back on everything I've taught you," he shouted, his voice rising to a fever pitch. Each accusation felt like a dagger, piercing through Jacob's heart, leaving him feeling more alone than ever. But the emotional onslaught didn't stop there. The argument escalated, fueled by years of pent-up anger and confusion. Father Michael, in a blind rage, began to hurl insults, questioning Jacob's worth and his very existence. "You think you can live like this? You are an abomination," he screamed, his words laced with venom. Jacob stood there, shattered, his heart pounding in his chest, feeling the walls of his world crumbling around him. Then, in an instant, the situation turned violent. In a fit of rage, Father Michael reached for a wooden object, a heavy, solid piece of furniture that had been a part of their home for years. According to court records, he struck Jacob repeatedly, delivering blow after blow, each one more brutal than the last. The sounds of the confrontation echoed through the house, a cacophony of shouts and cries for help that would haunt the neighborhood. Neighbors later reported hearing the screams, the desperate cries of a boy pleading for mercy. But in that moment, no one intervened. No one came to help. They had no idea that within those walls, a father was committing an act of unspeakable violence against his own child. It wasn't until it was too late that the reality of the situation became clear. A tragedy unfolding right next door, hidden behind the guise of faith and family. As the night wore on, the consequences of that fateful confession became painfully evident, setting the stage for a tragedy that would leave a community in shock and a family forever shattered. The silence of that quiet night in Alabama was shattered by the wail of sirens as police raced to the scene, alerted by a concerned neighbor who had heard the horrific commotion coming from Father Michael's home. When they arrived, the officers were met with a sight that would haunt them for the rest of their lives. There, in the middle of the living room floor, lay Jacob's lifeless body, his skin bruised and battered, his eyes closed, and his breath no longer stirring. The young man who had summoned the courage to reveal his truth to his father now lay motionless, the victim of a savage and unthinkable act of violence. Paramedics rushed to Jacob's aid, but as they frantically worked to revive him, it became painfully clear that the damage was too severe. Within minutes, the agonizing news was delivered. Jacob had succumbed to his injuries and was pronounced dead on arrival at the hospital. The community was reeling, their trust in their beloved priest shattered in an instant. As the authorities secured the scene and began their investigation, they encountered a suspect who displayed a chilling lack of remorse. Father Michael, the man who had once stood before his congregation as a beacon of morality and faith, now stood accused of murdering his own son. Police reports state that during his arrest he showed no signs of anguish or regret, only a cold, calculated defense of his actions. "My son's lifestyle was an abomination," Father Michael reportedly told the officers, his voice devoid of emotion. "I was simply upholding the teachings of the church. What I did for the sake of our family and our faith." The community was left in a state of shock, struggling to reconcile the man they had known with the monster that had emerged from the shadows. Many parishioners simply couldn't believe that their trusted priest, the man they had confided in, the man they had turned to for guidance and solace, was capable of such unfathomable cruelty. Yet, as the news of the tragedy spread, a deep divide began to emerge within the town. While some condemned Father Michael's actions, labeling him a murderer and calling for justice, others rallied behind him, claiming that Jacob's lifestyle choices had brought this tragedy upon himself and his family. "If he had just followed the teachings of the church, this never would have happened," one parishioner was quoted as saying, her voice laced with judgment and a disturbing lack of empathy. Father Michael was only trying to save his son's soul. It's a shame it had to come to this. The air was thick with tension as the community grappled with the devastating realization that the man they had entrusted with their spiritual well-being had betrayed that trust in the most horrific way imaginable. The once peaceful town was now a battleground, where the lines between right and wrong had become blurred, and the true cost of prejudice and intolerance was laid bare for all to see. As the trial began, the air in the courtroom was thick with anticipation and emotion. This was not just any trial, it was a reckoning for Father Michael, a man who had once been revered as a spiritual leader, now facing the gravest of charges, the murder of his only son. The spectators filed in, their faces a mixture of curiosity, shock, and sorrow, each one grappling with the reality of what had transpired. The prosecution wasted no time in painting a damning portrait of Father Michael. They argued that he was not just a father, but an abusive and controlling figure, one whose deep-seated prejudice had driven him to commit an unthinkable act of violence against his own child. They presented evidence that showed a pattern of intimidation and emotional abuse, revealing a man who could not accept his son's truth. This was not just a moment of rage, the lead prosecutor stated passionately, but the culmination of years of oppression and hatred, directed at a boy who only wanted to be loved for who he was. As the prosecution laid out their case, they brought forth witnesses who recounted the horror of that night, each testimony a painful reminder of the life that was lost. One of the most poignant moments came when Jacob's boyfriend Alex took the stand. With tears streaming down his face, he bravely recounted the fear Jacob had felt about coming out to his father. He was terrified, Alex shared, his voice trembling. He knew how his dad felt about people like us. I remember him saying, "What if he can't accept me? What if he hurts me?" Those words echoed through the courtroom, piercing the hearts of everyone present. But the defense, determined to salvage Father Michael's reputation, argued that he had acted out of a moment of passion. They claimed that his actions were fueled by his deep religious convictions, suggesting that in a fit of desperation he believed he was saving his son's soul from damnation. Father Michael was a man of faith, the defense attorney insisted, a man who genuinely believed he was doing the right thing in a moment of turmoil. They tried to paint him as a father who had lost control in a moment of overwhelming emotion, rather than a cold-blooded murderer. As the trial progressed, the evidence began to stack up against Father Michael. The prosecution presented the weapon used in the crime, a wooden object, the very same one that had been employed in the brutal beating. Autopsy reports detailed the extent of Jakob's injuries, the horrifying reality of the violence he had endured at the hands of his father. The cold facts of the case were laid bare, and the jury listened intently, each piece of evidence adding weight to the tragedy that had unfolded. After days of heart-wrenching testimonies and impassioned arguments, the jury finally retreated to deliberate. Tension hung in the air as the community awaited the verdict, each person holding their breath in the hope of justice for Jacob. Finally, after 3 long days, the jury returned, and the atmosphere in the courtroom shifted dramatically as the foreman stood to deliver their decision. "We, the jury, find the defendant guilty of second-degree murder." The words echoed in the room, a mix of relief and sorrow rippling through the audience. Father Michael, who had once been a figure of authority and respect, now sat defeated, the weight of his actions crashing down upon him. The reality of his conviction was a stark contrast to the life he had once led. As the judge pronounced the sentence, the words hung heavy in the air. "Father Michael is hereby sentenced to 25 years in prison, with no possibility of parole." The impact of the sentence reverberated through the courtroom, a bittersweet victory for those who had witnessed the horrors of that night. While justice had been served, it could never bring back Jacob, nor could it erase the scars left on a community forever changed by this tragedy. The aftermath of Jakob's tragic death sent shockwaves through the community and far beyond, reverberating into the very heart of the LGBTQ+ movement. This heartbreaking case shone a harsh light on the dangers that LGBTQ+ youth often face in religious households, where acceptance is frequently overshadowed by fear and prejudice. In the wake of the trial, many advocates began to speak out, urging for more awareness and protection for young people who bravely come out to their families. They highlighted the alarming statistics that reveal how many LGBTQ+ youth experience rejection, abuse, or even violence from their own parents. Research indicates that LGBTQ+ individuals are significantly more likely to face homelessness and mental health struggles compared to their heterosexual peers, often as a direct result of familial rejection. In response to the tragedy, several organizations rallied together to provide support for LGBTQ+ youth and their families. Initiatives were launched to educate parents about the importance of love, acceptance, and understanding. Community workshops began to emerge, aimed at dismantling the stigma surrounding LGBTQ+ identities. The message was clear: no child should ever have to fear for their life because of who they are. Jacob's story became a catalyst for change, igniting conversations that many had tried to avoid for far too long. Jacob's surviving relatives, heartbroken and devastated, stepped forward to share their own pain, urging other parents to choose love and acceptance over hatred and violence. "We've lost our son, but we don't want other families to suffer the same fate," they pleaded in interviews, their voices trembling with emotion. "It's vital for parents to understand that their children need love, not judgment. We hope that Jacob's story will encourage other families to embrace their kids no matter who they love." Their message resonated with many, serving as a heartfelt reminder of the unconditional love that every child deserves. They proclaimed that it is the deity, the mirror of our being, that who has power over us, lifted us from the senseless bulk, preserved by his past. The question of Father Michael's reflection on his actions began to surface. Years later, reports emerged suggesting that he had expressed some form of regret for his behavior during that fateful night. However, many questioned the sincerity of his remorse. Some family members and community members felt that it was too little, too late. "How can you truly regret something if you still justify your actions?" one local activist remarked, echoing the sentiments of many who had been affected by the tragedy. Father Michael's case became a pivotal moment not only in the lives of those directly involved, but also for countless others who were touched by the legacy of Jacob's story. It served as a stark reminder of the real-life consequences of intolerance and the urgent need for compassion, understanding, and acceptance in society. In the end, Jacob's story is one of love lost and the call for change. It is a reminder that every child deserves to be embraced for who they are, that love should never be conditional, and that the fight for acceptance and equality must continue. As we reflect on this tragedy, let us carry forward the lessons learned, ensuring that no child ever has to face the same fate as Jacob. As we come to the end of this heartbreaking journey, we must take a moment to reflect on the profound impact of Jacob's story. It serves as a painful reminder of the cost of hatred and intolerance, a chilling testament to the dangers that many young people face when they dare to be true to themselves. No child should ever have to live in fear of being rejected, harmed, or worse, simply because of who they are. The lessons learned from this tragedy are stark and unavoidable. We invite you to think deeply about the world we live in. What are your thoughts on this tragic case? How can we, as a society, do better? We want to hear from you. Let's discuss in the comments below. Your voices matter. Your experiences matter. By sharing your thoughts, you can help foster a dialogue about acceptance, love, and understanding. If you believe in creating a world where love triumphs over hate, consider sharing Jacob's story to raise awareness. The more we talk about these issues, the more we can help prevent tragedies like this from happening again. Every conversation counts, and together, we can make a difference. And if you found this case heartbreaking, stay tuned for our next video, where we uncover another shocking story of prejudice and violence. We will continue to shine a light on the issues that matter, stories that need to be told, and voices that deserve to be heard. Thank you for joining us today. Let's remember Jacob, not just as a victim, but as a symbol of the fight for love and acceptance. Until next time, let's continue to strive for a world where every individual can live freely and without fear.